Laura Bennett moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU in Norfolk with the kind of invisible competence that made her forgettable. Exactly how she needed it. The fluorescent lights hummed above polished linoleum as she checked the cardiac monitor for room 312, her hand steady on the fall line, fingers moving with an economy of motion that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school. Somewhere that involved blood and sand and decisions made in seconds. She kept her brown hair pulled back tight. No jewelry. Scrubs loose enough to hide the shrapnel scars running down her left shoulder like lightning strikes. In the break room earlier that morning, she'd touched the inside pocket of her jacket where the patch rested, a habitual gesture, unconscious, the kind of habit built over 20 years of muscle memory. The faded unit patch. Blood type still visible in the stitching after all this time. She pulled her hand away before anyone noticed. Dr. Hargrove entered the ICU at 7:43 a.m. with his usual entourage of residents trailing behind him like satellites orbiting a dying star. His shoes clicked against the tile, expensive leather, Italian, the kind that signaled board connections and surgical egos carefully maintained. He was 48, had been chief of surgery for 6 years, and had never performed an emergency procedure that he hadn't prepared for in advance. His reputation was built not on surgical hands but on cultivated relationships. A phone call to a board member. A favor owed. A carefully managed hierarchy where everyone knew their place and Laura Bennett knew hers, invisible, compliant, manageable. He watched her work from across the unit. She was checking vitals on a post-op patient, her movements precise and unhurried. Her gloved hands worked with the kind of fluidity that spoke of repetition, but Dr. Hargrove saw only another nurse in a building full of them. Forgettable. She didn't speak up in staff meetings. Didn't challenge his diagnoses. Didn't attend hospital social events. Perfect. The kind of employee who made no waves and caused no trouble. He turned to his residents and said something that made them laugh, their voices sharp and bright in the fluorescent silence. Laura didn't look up. She never did. At 8:15 a.m., the ER doors opened downstairs with the kind of velocity that meant trauma. The overhead intercom crackled, "Trauma alert, room 314, ETA 3 minutes. Gunshot wounds, multiple, Baghdad incident, naval personnel." The hospital shifted. That invisible current that runs through medical buildings when death is walking through the doors in a stretcher. Laura felt it before she heard it. 20 years of her nervous system trained to recognize the frequency of urgency. She moved toward the stairwell without being asked, muscle memory stronger than protocol. Room 314 was on the second floor. She reached it in 40 seconds. The stretcher arrived with the sound of wheels squeaking against linoleum, a sound like small animals in distress. 2 paramedics moved with practiced speed, calling out vitals in the compressed language of emergency medicine. Gunshot wounds. 9 of them. Entry wounds and exit wounds. 1 through the right lung. 1 through the abdomen. 1 through the left thigh that had severed the femoral artery. Captain James Morrison, Navy, age 39, conscious but pale, his blue eyes moving around the room with a kind of focus that came from staying alive by will alone. Laura stopped moving. The photograph in her mind, the one she kept locked away in the part of her brain reserved for survival, collided with the man in the stretcher. 20 years. 2 decades of distance. She had pulled a child from a burning Humvee outside Fallujah, his uniform soaked in blood that wasn't all his own, his voice calling for his mother in a way that no 7-year-old should ever have to sound. She had sewn his blood type on a patch, O negative, rare, critical, and kept it in her jacket lining because she never expected to see him again. Because people didn't come back from memories like that. Because you survived, moved on, became invisible, and forgot. Except she had never forgotten. Not once in 20 years. Captain Morrison's eyes found her across the room. His hand moved slightly, a gesture like reaching. Dr. Hargrove was already shouting orders, his voice authoritative and efficient, his hands moving to examine the wounds. The residents clustered around him like birds at a feeder. The trauma team moved with choreographed precision. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation at 92%. A wound that needed immediate surgical intervention. Laura moved to the bedside. She didn't speak. She began cutting away his uniform with trauma shears, her movements faster than thought, her hands knowing exactly where to go. The blood was dark and slick and warm. Real. Present. A language she spoke fluently. Beneath the blood and the uniform was a tattoo on his chest, a silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter with the words Angel 6 stenciled underneath. She reached into her pocket without thinking. Her fingers found the patch. She pulled it out and held it where only he could see. The faded unit patch. ONEG. The blood-type stitching still visible after all these years. Captain Morrison's hand moved again. His fingers found hers. He whispered a single word so quiet that only she heard it over the monitors and the voices and the chaos. Miracle. That was her call sign. That was what they called her in the field, when she moved through combat zones with the kind of calm that came from having already accepted that you might not leave alive. When she pulled Marines from IED blasts while shrapnel sang through the air around her. When she sewn blood-type patches and held hands and made promises to bring people home. Miracle. Laura's hand trembled. Not with fear. With restraint. The kind of trembling that comes from keeping everything locked down so tightly that your bones feel like they might splinter. She released his hand and stepped back. Her face showed nothing. A nurse. Just another nurse checking vitals. She turned to Dr. Hargrove and said, her voice steady and low, pressure dropping. 92/58. We need to move to OR. Dr. Hargrove glanced at her and then looked away. Just another nurse stating the obvious. He raised his hand and nodded to the surgical team. The stretcher began moving. The monitors beeped their electronic rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless white noise song. Laura watched Captain Morrison disappear through the OR doors. She stood very still. Around her, the ICU continued its normal operations. Other monitors beeped. Other nurses moved. Other doctors barked orders and checked tablets and managed their small empires of institutional power. She reached into her pocket and felt the patch still there. The blood type still visible. O negative. Critical. Rare. The kind of blood that was hard to find, but she had carried the knowledge of it for 20 years. She had sewn it with her own hands in a moment of defiance against the idea that anything matters more than saving the people you love. Dr. Hargrove stood in the corner of the ICU, watching the doors where the stretcher had vanished. He pulled out his phone. One finger moved across the screen. A text message to the hospital board president. The message was brief and calculated, staffing concern ICU protocols. Discussion needed regarding scope creep. Call me when you have time. He smiled. Not a warm expression. The kind of smile that comes from knowing exactly how to make problems disappear. The ICU returned to its fluorescent hum. The fluorescent ceiling panels cast everything in the same institutional white as Laura wheeled the vitals cart into room 314 just after 0800. Captain Morrison lay propped on pillows, still swollen from the initial surgery, his wife seated beside the bed with a coffee she'd reheated twice. The night shift had documented stable vitals through all 4 hours. Stable and boring was exactly what the cardiac monitor wanted to show Dr. Hargrove when he swept in with his white coat trailing behind him like a cape, already talking before he crossed the threshold. Captain Morrison, let's talk about your pain management protocol, Hargrove said, not to the patient but to the wife, as if the man in the bed was already a historical artifact. I'm thinking we transition from the current morphine dosage to a hybrid regimen. 10 milligrams for every 4 hours, supplemented with, he turned to the chart, pen poised with theatrical authority. Let me recalculate this to be certain. Your weight is listed as 195 pounds. That's roughly 89 kilograms. At 0.11 milligrams per kilogram, that puts us at approximately 9.8 milligrams every 4 hours. Laura felt the air change in her lungs before she opened her mouth. The calculation was wrong by nearly 10%, a dosage that would suppress his respiratory drive dangerously, especially with the pneumothorax risk that hadn't fully resolved. She'd verified his weight this morning. 89 kilograms at 0.1 milligrams per kilogram for post-operative cardiac stability was 8.9 milligrams, not 9.8. The difference between competent care and a patient spending the next 48 hours fighting to breathe. Her voice came out the way it always did, soft, deferential, the tone of someone asking permission to exist. Dr. Hargrove, I believe the cardiac protocol for post-operative morphine in patients with recent thoracic trauma recommends 0.1 milligrams per kilogram, not 0.11. That would be 8.9 milligrams every 4 hours. She didn't point out the error. She simply provided the correction like it was a weather report. Professional. Helpful. Invisible. The room locked down like a vault door slamming. Captain Morrison's wife stopped breathing mid-sip of cold coffee. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm into a silence that suddenly felt dangerous. Dr. Hargrove's pen hovered an inch from the chart. When he turned to look at Laura, she saw the calculation happen in real time behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of how publicly humiliated he'd just been, in front of a patient's family, by a nurse who worked 8-hour shifts for $42,000 a year while he commanded a surgeon's salary and board connections. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that lived in the space between civility and threat. Thank you, Nurse Bennett, but I don't recall asking for your input. He said it with the precision of someone hanging a declaration. I attended Johns Hopkins Medical School. I believe I can manage basic pharmaceutical calculations. He turned back to the chart and wrote 9.8 into the morphine protocol with deliberate, visible strokes. Each letter was a message. I do appreciate the enthusiasm, but let's leave the advanced clinical decisions to the physicians, shall we? Laura said nothing. She adjusted the 4-drip rate by hand, changing it to 8.9 milligrams while documenting the correction in the digital chart under her own credentials. Hargrove saw her do it. His jaw tightened. He left the room without another word, but that was almost worse than if he'd thrown something. 2 hours later, a printed document appeared on the unit board in the break room. Laura saw it while refilling her water bottle, though she wasn't surprised. The moment she'd corrected him, something fundamental had shifted into motion. Her shoes were Dansko clogs. Charcoal gray. Identical to the shoes worn by every nurse on the ICU floor, the Dansko was basically the ICU uniform. She'd bought them the same week as 3 other nurses on her unit. The violation was a fiction, which meant it was also a message, pinned to the break room board for 17 nurses to read. A message that said, correct me, and this is what happens. This is the cost of making me look foolish. 3 days passed in a rhythm of medication rounds and vital sign checks. The captain improved incrementally, though he watched Laura with eyes that held something deeper than morphine haze. His wife brought flowers. The morning shift nurse documented stable progression. Everything in room 314 was moving in the right direction except for the invisible deterioration happening to Laura's standing in the unit. The break room was where it happened, 3 days later at lunch. Laura sat at the small round table with her sandwich, turkey on wheat, no mayo, and opened her lunch container with movements so practiced they barely registered as human action. For exactly 8 seconds, the room held the kind of silence that comes before something organized. Then chairs scraped. The sound was synchronous, like an orchestra of rejection. One nurse stood and left. Then another. Then 2 more, their movements coordinated with the precision of a dance they'd rehearsed through group text messages Laura wasn't included in. The unit secretary, a woman named Rachel who used to eat lunch across from Laura 3 times a week, gathered her yogurt container and her phone and left without making eye contact. Her chair scraped loudest. Within 90 seconds, the break room emptied until Laura sat alone at the round table, her sandwich cooling on a paper napkin, the fluorescent lights humming their institutional song overhead. The silence was so complete it had weight, the physical absence of people creating a presence all its own. Laura took one measured breath. She bit into her sandwich. She chewed slowly, mechanically, with the same careful precision she applied to every task. A small drop of dressing touched her lip. She wiped it away with the napkin. No tremor in her hands. No change in her breathing pattern. Nothing in her face that suggested the weight of the message had registered. But that wasn't the worst part. 20 minutes later, she passed the unit secretary's desk and heard Rachel speaking quietly into her phone. "Yeah, some people just don't understand that team players get ahead here. If you can't read the room, you shouldn't be in the room." The words had been planted, meant to carry, meant to be repeated. A narrative was being constructed in the space where truth used to live. Laura was becoming a story. A cautionary tale. A name you didn't want to be associated with if you valued your position. The following Thursday, during a family conference about Captain Morrison's recovery timeline, Dr. Hargrove orchestrated his most deliberate strike. The captain's wife sat in the consultation room, stress aging her face in real time. 2 residents flanked Hargrove. Laura stood back by the door, chart in hand, ready to answer any clinical questions that required her knowledge of the patient's actual condition hour by hour. "Mrs. Morrison, I want to address something," Hargrove said, his voice dropping into the register that men used when they were performing concern for an audience. "Your husband is recovering beautifully, but I've noticed our protocol Penny here," he gestured dismissively at Laura without turning to look at her, "has been hovering extensively. Emotionally invested, you might say. It's a common risk in nursing where boundaries blur and attachment compromises clinical judgment. Some nurses are simply too emotionally unstable for critical care environments. I want to assure you that I'll be reassigning his care to one of our more clinically objective team members, someone who can maintain proper professional distance." The residents didn't react. They'd been trained not to. Mrs. Morrison looked confused. No one had seemed emotionally unstable about anything. But confusion in the face of authority reads as truth, and the narrative was being established. Protocol Penny. Emotionally unstable. Hovering. Words designed to dissolve professional credibility into a personality deficiency. A single tear escaped down Laura's cheek. It surprised her, not because she was breaking, but because her body was processing this moment without permission from her conscious mind. The tear ran its track and hung at her jaw. She could taste the salt at the corner of her mouth. Hargrove saw it and his shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. He'd achieved the goal. He'd made the tough nurse cry in front of witnesses. He'd broken something. Laura raised her hand and wiped the tear away with the heel of her palm. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She held Hargrove's eyes with the kind of steady gaze that belonged to someone calculating distance and wind speed. "Strange how my patients have the lowest mortality rate on this floor," she said. Her voice was flat. Perfectly modulated. The voice of someone reading statistics, not emotion. The data speaks for itself. The room went dead silent. Captain Morrison, who'd been quiet in his bed across the room, made a small sound, not quite a laugh, more like recognition. His eyes tracked Laura's movement as she stepped forward with the chart and reviewed his upcoming medication schedule with Mrs. Morrison, her clinical competence on full display, her voice dropping back into the register of invisibility. Hargrove left without responding. That was worse than anger. Silence was strategy. Over the next 5 days, her name began appearing in performance reviews that Hargrove circulated through digital channels, each one citing failure to demonstrate team cohesion and concerning interpersonal dynamics. The nursing director started using Penny in official emails, the nickname spreading through the system like contamination. Hargrove made phone calls during lunch breaks. Laura could see him in his office through the glass, phone pressed to his ear, his board member contacts being activated, debts being called in, a narrative being constructed at the administrative level. The paper trail was being laid. Documentation that would make her termination look like a rational institutional decision rather than what it actually was, an execution. The captain watched all of it from room 314, something nagging at the edges of his consciousness. The way her hands moved with that specific efficiency. The calm in her voice like gravity, pulling everything toward stability. The single tear, instantly controlled. Something from 20 years ago and 6,000 miles away was trying to surface through his morphine haze, but couldn't quite break the chemical barrier. That night, as Laura finished her shift at 2,000 hours, she checked room 314 one final time. The captain was asleep, his vital signs steady, his oxygen saturation at 96%. His trachea was midline. His lungs were clear. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. She pressed her fingertips to the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with his blood type stitched in 23 years ago, the patch she'd carried every single day through civilian life and back again, and whispered something no one else could hear. But at 0300 hours on the morning of day 6, the machinery would speak. At 0300 hours, the monitors began their conversation in a language most people never learned to speak. Laura stood at the foot of Captain Morrison's bed, watching the numbers fall like dominoes in slow motion. Oxygen saturation 94. 92. 88. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but something underneath that sound was wrong, a quality of resistance, pressure building where it shouldn't exist. His trachea had shifted 3 millimeters to the left on the last portable chest X-ray. Nobody else had noticed. They saw the numbers on the monitor and charted them. Laura saw the story the numbers were telling. Tension pneumothorax. Air pocket collapsing the right lung, pushing against the heart's chambers like a fist pressing on a water balloon. In field medicine, this was the kill of choice. Fast. Invisible until it was too late. She'd seen it happen in the trucks rolling out of Fallujah, Jolan district, where the dust got into everything and the wounded arrived with wounds stacked on top of wounds. She'd felt the shift in a patient's spine when the pressure came. She'd learned to move before anyone said code. Laura's hands moved on their own. 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the textbook location every combat medic learned in their sleep. She didn't call for backup. She didn't page the resident. The code team was still 3 hallways away. Captain Morrison's oxygen sat was 76 and dropping. Time wasn't information. Time was the enemy. The needle went in with a whisper of resistance, then broke through the pleural membrane with the faintest pop. The hiss of air escaping was louder than a scream. Pressure releasing. Lung re-expanding. The sound of a body remembering how to breathe. 78. 82. 88. 91. Sinus rhythm steady. Dr. Hargrove walked through the door at the exact moment Laura withdrew the needle. His eyes moved from the captain stabilizing vital signs to the angiocath in Laura's gloved hand to her face, calm, measured, without the tremor that should have been there. The expression that crossed his features was something between confusion and rage, a man watching a chess piece move itself without permission. "Everyone out," Hargrove said. His voice had dropped into that register it took when he felt threatened. "Stat. Now." The code team exchanged glances but obeyed. Hargrove waited until the door closed before he stepped closer. His presence moved through the room like something heavy and pressurized, like the air itself was being compressed. "Nurse Bennett, you just performed a surgical intervention without physician authorization. That's practicing medicine without a license. Do you understand what you've done?" Laura was already documenting. The needle gauge. The insertion time. The pressure release. The vital sign recovery. Precise medical language, clinical notation, a record that could defend itself. Emergent decompression. Patient was in extremis. Oxygen saturation 72% at time of intervention. I don't care if it was 70%. Hargrove's jaw had tightened into a line that could cut glass. You don't perform procedures. You assist. You call. You escalate. You do not decide you're qualified to open this patient up just because you think you're having some moment. He pulled his phone from his pocket before Laura could respond. I'm making calls. This ends now. He stepped into the hallway and she heard the phone dial. Then his voice, pitched low and urgent, Bill, it's Richard Hargrove. I know it's 3 in the morning. I know you're not awake. Wake up. I need you to pull personnel records on a staff nurse named Laura Bennett. Yes, I know it's the middle of the night. This is a liability issue that could cost the hospital millions. A pause. Correct. The Navy captain. Yes. She just performed what amounts to field medicine on a military patient with a completely unsanctioned procedure. No supervision. No consultation. Dangerous doesn't begin to describe it. Behind the closed door, Captain Morrison's breathing had stabilized into something like normal. The monitors no longer screamed. He was sedated, unaware of what had just happened, of who had just held his life in steady hands. But his eyes moved beneath closed lids, and when Laura wiped the adhesive from her fingers, she thought she saw him trying to wake, trying to speak something that the morphine wouldn't let through. By 0400 hours, Hargrove's network was moving. He called the hospital board president during her early morning jog, framing the incident as a rogue nurse endangering a high-profile military patient. He contacted every previous employer listed on Laura's references, civilian hospitals with no record of her military service, no knowledge of the real identity hidden beneath the quiet competence, and demanded they provide concerning pattern reviews. His voice on those calls was smooth and practiced, a man who'd weaponized institutional authority so many times that the motions had become muscle memory. He brought in an outside consultant from the state nursing board. By 0500 hours, there was already paperwork moving through hospital channels. Laura sat in the break room at 0530, coffee cooling in front of her, watching the fluorescent panels above cast their pale light across the laminate table. She knew what was coming. She'd seen this pattern before, watched institutions protect themselves, watched people who asked the wrong questions get reassigned or pushed out. The difference was that this time, she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd acted. She'd saved a life. She'd done it without permission, without the hierarchy's approval, and that was a sin that institutional systems couldn't tolerate. Her phone buzzed at 0545. Nursing director requesting her presence in the administrative office at 0600 hours. At 0558, security escort came to find her? Laura stood when they arrived, a man in a grey uniform and a nursing director she'd seen in hallways but never spoken to directly. The escort's hand was not on his belt, not threatening, but his posture said he'd been instructed to ensure compliance. Your access badge, please, the director said. There was no anger in her voice. That was worse, somehow. Anger would have suggested she cared about the decision. This was procedural. This was already decided. Laura unclipped the badge from her scrub pocket and placed it in the woman's extended palm. The laminate felt lighter than it should have. 5 years at Oak Creek Memorial, and it felt like it weighed nothing at all. You're suspended pending investigation, the director continued, reading from a memo that bore Hargrove's handwriting. Unauthorized procedures. Scope violation. Patient endangerment. You're not to return to the floor, not to contact staff, not to access any hospital system. We'll be in touch regarding the formal hearing. Laura's hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. The patient's condition improved. Oxygen saturation rose from 72 to 91%. Heart rate stabilized. He was in extremis. That's for the review board to determine. The director turned away. The escort gestured toward the elevator. You need to leave the building now. They walked her through the hallway at 0615 hours, past the night shift nurses who were beginning their handoff reports, past the open doors of rooms where other people's crises continued without interruption. Hargrove stood near the nurses' station, arms crossed, flanked by 2 board members he'd managed to call in at this hour. He didn't speak. He watched. That was the punishment he wanted, not violence, not confrontation, but witnessing. Watching her walk out. Watching her removed from the system he'd carefully constructed. Laura's jacket hung in her locker in the changing room. She retrieved it slowly, methodically, the same way she did everything. Her hands moved without conscious direction, muscle memory taking over. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside the lining, the stitching faded but holding. She'd carried that patch through 2 decades of civilian life, through sleepless nights when the memories tried to surface, through every quiet shift in a hospital where no one knew who she really was. She pressed her fingertips against it once before buttoning the jacket. The rain outside came down like applause on the parking lot, cold and relentless. She walked through it without hurrying, without slowing, her boots on wet asphalt making no sound at all. Behind her, the building's lights blazed against the dark morning. Inside room 314, Captain Morrison would wake to a different nurse, one who didn't know him, one who would chart vitals and administer medications without understanding what it meant to hold someone's life in your hands twice across 20 years. What happened next would arrive by helicopter. The consultant arrived at 0930 hours, a woman with a clipboard and the kind of practice neutrality that meant nothing good. Dr. Hargrove walked her past Laura's station without introduction, their voices low enough that only fragments reached her, pattern of insubordination, scope creep, autonomy outside protocol. Laura continued charting vitals, her hand steady, her breathing measured. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in that particular hospital white that made even daylight look sick. She'd learned long ago not to listen to the words meant to hurt her. She listened instead to the monitor beside Captain Morrison's bed, the rhythm steady now, the oxygen saturation holding at 96%. That was the only conversation that mattered. By 10:30, the consultant was interviewing other staff members in the break room. Laura could see them through the window as she passed, nurses nodding, giving statements, their body language the careful distance of people who didn't want to be associated with a sinking ship. One of them was Jennifer, who'd sat with her last Tuesday and shared a bag of chips. Jennifer wouldn't meet her eyes now. Laura moved through the corridor like she was made of water, present but untouchable, leaving no ripples. At 11:45, Hargrove called her into his office. The office smelled like cologne and leather, expensive things that couldn't mask the underneath smell of fear mixed with ambition. Hargrove sat behind his desk like a general at a war table, the consultant standing beside him with her clipboard held against her chest like armor. The needle decompression, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the tone of a man reading charges. You performed an emergency procedure without physician authorization. Without even notifying the code team that you'd taken autonomous action. Laura stood in the doorway, her hands at her sides. She didn't ask permission to speak. The patient's oxygen saturation was 64%. Tracheal deviation indicated tension pneumothorax. ETA on the code team was 3 minutes. The patient had 2 minutes. That's not your assessment to make. Muscle memory disagreed. The words came out flat. True. Without apology. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting either tears or defensiveness, and instead he'd gotten a woman stating facts like she was reading a grocery list. The consultant made a note. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled like a priest about to deliver damnation. Your badge is suspended effective immediately, he said. Hospital security will escort you from the building. You're not to return to any unit without explicit authorization from administration. We're referring this incident to the nursing board for investigation of practicing beyond your scope of license. The words landed like they were meant to, heavy, final, institutional. This wasn't a man making a decision. This was a man using the weight of an entire hospital to crush a problem that had refused to stay small enough to ignore. Understood, Laura said. You can collect your personal items from your locker under security supervision. Your employment status is pending the board's investigation. Laura nodded once. She could feel the moment taking shape around her like concrete setting, the future narrowing down to a single point, out. Gone. The invisible nurse finally invisible to everyone, for all the wrong reasons. She turned to leave. And Bennett, Hargrove called after her, his voice slick with something like satisfaction. Dangerous deviation from protocol. I hope your next job appreciates that kind of recklessness. She didn't turn around. She didn't respond. Her composure was a locked door and she'd thrown away the key somewhere in Baghdad, in a place where protocols meant nothing against the sound of a child's breathing stopping. Security met her at her locker. Two officers in Navy uniforms with the kind of professional distance that meant they'd done this before, walked people out, stripped them of access, reduced them from staff to liability in 6 minutes. She removed her personal items, a photo of Emma at age 7, a small plant someone had given her when she started, a book she'd been reading for 4 months and never finished. The plant was dying. She left it on the counter. The drive home was sunrise over water, the James River shimmering gold and indifferent. Laura's scrubs were still damp from Captain Morrison's room. She could smell the antiseptic, the particular tang of a medical crisis, the way violence and medicine smelled almost identical under fluorescent lights. She'd had 5 years to build a new life in the space between this moment and the last time she'd worn a uniform that meant something. 5 years of anonymity. 5 years of waking without the sound of IED explosions in her ears. 5 years of being nobody important enough to hurt. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her heart rate was elevated but manageable. The PTSD symptoms she'd worked for 60 months to control were still controlled, no hyperventilation, no dissociation, no diving for cover when a car horn sounded. She was managing. She was fine. She was driving home at 0700 hours in the morning light wearing scrubs that smelled like another man's blood and trying not to think about the fact that she'd just lost the only job that had ever let her pretend to be normal. The kitchen table was where Emma found her at 0715. Laura had made it from the car to the house to the table without changing, without calling anyone, without doing anything but sitting in yesterday's clothes and watching the light move across the wood grain. The coffee she'd made was cold. She hadn't drunk it. Emma had the key from under the flower pot because Mom had taught her the emergency procedure when she was 10. Emma came through the door talking about her overnight at Grandma's house, about the movie they'd watched, about how Grandma had let her stay up past midnight, and then Emma saw her mother at the table and the words stopped like someone had cut the audio. Mommy. Emma's voice changed entirely, became small, became the voice of a child who'd learned to recognize when something in her mother had broken. Did you get fired? Laura couldn't answer. The composure that had carried her through humiliation, through isolation, through watching her colleagues systematically dismantle her reputation, that composure shattered like a dropped vial of something irreplaceable. The tears came without permission, without warning, just salt water falling onto the kitchen table like rain on a place that had never expected to flood. Emma moved to her without hesitation. 12 years old and already fluent in the language of her mother's damage. She wrapped her arms around Laura's shoulders and didn't ask questions. She just held on. Laura pulled her daughter close and breathed the smell of her hair, strawberry shampoo and sleep and the particular comfort of a child who still believed her mother could fix anything, even this. Especially this. She held Emma like she'd held Captain Morrison in that burning Humvee, like she'd held 3 Marines in the rubble of an IED blast, like she held every person she'd ever saved with her hands and failed to save with everything else. She held her daughter and didn't say, "Yes, they fired me." She said nothing at all. What Laura didn't know was that in his office at Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove was making the first mistake that would unravel everything. His triumph was incomplete without finality, without documentation carved so deep into the institutional record that no appeal could ever reverse it. He needed Laura's file to be permanently marked, her history rewritten, her return made mathematically impossible. At 0800, he attempted to access her complete personnel records through the hospital database system. The system denied him. Her employment file was sealed by medical board review. So he called in a favor, board member contact, one of the reliable ones, and requested override access to see anything in her background that might justify the termination. The override succeeded. The access was granted. And Dr. Hargrove found something he couldn't have possibly expected. Before 2019, Laura Bennett's employment history simply didn't exist. Her social security number had a flag. A military flag. A federal security clearance designation that he was never supposed to access, never supposed to see, never supposed to touch with his civilian credentials and his suburban ambitions. He read it anyway. In Quantico, Virginia, a database monitoring system registered the unauthorized access attempts to federal personnel files from a civilian healthcare network. The system flagged it. In 30 seconds, it escalated. In 2 minutes, it reached the National Security Administration. In 5 minutes, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service opened an alert. And in a phone call made at 0830 hours from a house in Virginia Beach, Captain Morrison's wife was explaining to a Pentagon liaison officer exactly what kind of nurse had saved her husband's life and then been fired for it, a call that would set in motion a sequence of events that neither Dr. Hargrove nor Laura Bennett had any idea was already falling like dominoes toward 1,400 hours, toward a Black Hawk helicopter, toward the moment when the Pentagon showed up and the carefully constructed lie of Laura Bennett's ordinary life became impossible to maintain. But Laura didn't know that yet. At 0720, all she knew was the weight of her daughter in her arms, the cold coffee on the table beside them, the morning light moving across the kitchen floor like a clock counting down to something neither of them could see coming. The rotor wash hit the hospital windows at 07 for 8 hours exactly. Black Hawk. UH-60M, unmarked except for a single star on the tailboom that meant Pentagon, which meant authority that didn't answer to hospital administrators. Laura was sitting in her car in the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot, still wearing her scrubs, her badge suspended in the cup holder like a severed finger, when the helicopter descended toward the rooftop helipad. She didn't look up. Couldn't look up. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel, not from fear, from the particular exhaustion that comes from being right while losing everything. The badge was on her lap when the first text came through. From a number she didn't recognize, "Stay where you are. You're about to receive visitors." She stared at the message. Stared at it again. Her daughter Emma was at school. The kitchen table was still holding the cold coffee. Nothing had changed except everything. 3 Black Hawks descended in formation. Not standard. Not routine. The hospital's parking lot began to fill with vehicles that didn't have hospital logos, dark sedans with government plates, a single ambulance with military medical insignia. Laura watched from her car as men and women in pressed uniforms moved through the main entrance with a kind of coordinated precision that came from training, from purpose, from authority measured in decades rather than titles. She didn't move. They knew where she was. The first Pentagon official found her in the parking lot at 0756 hours. Woman. Navy. Captain rank. Eyes that had seen things worse than a suspended badge. Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett. Not a question. I'm Captain Melissa Chen, NCIS Liaison to Naval Personnel. You need to come with us. Room 314. Captain Morrison is asking for you. Laura's hands went still. I was terminated 45 minutes ago. I'm aware. That termination is being reversed. Effective immediately. You're cleared for patient contact under military escort. You're also cleared for a full briefing on what's about to happen in this hospital. Chen's voice had the texture of stainless steel, cold, reflective, absolutely certain. We have 48 hours of documentation showing exactly what Dr. Richard Hargrove attempted. It's going to be a very loud next 4 hours. We wanted you somewhere safe when it started. They walked through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors like a current moving upstream. Nurses stopped in doorways. Administrators froze mid-stride. The security guard who'd escorted Laura out of the building that morning stared at the uniforms and then looked away. 3 military personnel, 1 suspended nurse, 1 Marine in dress blue standing watch outside the elevators. This was not how hospitals normally moved. The elevator climbed. Floor 3. Floor 5. Floor 8. Her lungs were doing something strange, not quite breathing, not quite holding. She hadn't been allowed to visit Captain Morrison since her termination. Hadn't been allowed near his room. Protocol, they'd said. Procedure, they'd said. Which meant Dr. Hargrove had ordered it, which meant he'd known, which meant he'd been afraid. Room 314's door opened, and Captain James Morrison, the boy with shrapnel in his left shoulder and a bleeding gash across his forehead from the Humvee frame that she'd held pressure on while calling for a medevac 20 years ago, turned his head. His eyes found hers and stayed. "Miracle," he whispered. "Not a question." A fact. A name he'd kept inside his chest for 2 decades like a compass pointing home. Laura didn't move. Didn't cross the room. Did not let herself feel the 20 years collapsing into this moment, this room, this man who was supposed to be dead in the sand and wasn't because she'd been bleeding too and still kept her hand steady. Captain Chen stepped forward with a file folder that looked official enough to stop wars. Captain Morrison, with your permission, I'm going to read Senior Chief Bennett's service record aloud. For the official record. Morrison nodded. Reached for Laura's hand. His fingers found hers, and the contact was like finding something you thought you'd lost forever. Bronze Star, Chen said, her voice cutting through the room like a laser through flesh. The words fell like stones into water. Silver Star for heroism under fire, Helmand Province, 2009. Combat Action Ribbon. The Purple Heart. Another pause. Another breath. Second Purple Heart. Third. And fourth, awarded following a mine blast that killed 2 Marines under her direct care. The silence stretched. 2 Navy Crosses. For extraordinary heroism in the presence of enemy fire. First awarded 2008. Second awarded 2011. The room did not go quiet. The room held its breath. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett pulled 3 Marines from a burning vehicle while taking shrapnel across her chest, left arm, and right leg. Chen continued. She administered combat trauma care with a sucking chest wound and a fractured radius. She stayed conscious for 47 minutes in that state. She waited 6 minutes after the last Marine was loaded before she called for her own extraction. Captain Morrison's grip tightened on her hand. Laura's jaw clenched once. Released. That was the only reaction she allowed herself. The door opened at 0819 hours. FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb entered with 2 additional agents. Not the kind of entrance that required permission. The kind that meant authority had shifted its center of gravity. Dr. Richard Hargrove is under arrest, Webb said to the room, though he was looking at Laura. Federal charges include forgery of military personnel records, unauthorized access to classified Department of Defense databases, attempted obstruction of military personnel, and conspiracy to defraud a federal employee. The words fell like dominoes. Like the first brick removed from a wall that looks solid until you realize it isn't. At 0634 hours this morning, Dr. Hargrove attempted to access Senior Chief Bennett's military record in a federal database he has no clearance to touch, Webb continued. The access triggered an automated alert. At 0651 hours, this hospital received a preliminary investigation request from NCIS. By 0715 hours, we had a warrant. At 0717 hours, we executed that warrant on Dr. Hargrove's office and personal residence. What we found was evidence of a pattern of forged documentation targeting at least 7 healthcare employees over the past 12 years. His attempts to fabricate grounds for your termination, Senior Chief, revealed a systematic approach to institutional destruction that extends far beyond your case. The hospital's overhead intercom crackled. A voice announced that Dr. Richard Hargrove was being requested to the main lobby. Immediately. Not a request. A command. Laura watched from room 314's window as Dr. Hargrove walked toward the elevators in the main corridor, his stride still confident, still certain that hierarchy and connections and 43 years of practiced arrogance meant something. He didn't know yet. Hadn't seen the agents. Hadn't understood that the ground beneath him had become quicksand. The elevators opened. The agent stepped forward. The moment lasted 3 seconds, maybe less. Hargrove's face cycled through confusion, then recognition, then the particular expression of someone realizing they'd miscalculated which wolves were actually lions. 2 agents on either side. 1 reading rights. His hands behind his back before he could process the request. 3 different cell phones captured the perp walk through the lobby. Nurses stopped. Patients looked up from wheelchairs. The consultant he'd hired to investigate Laura watched from the hallway, her face draining white when she understood what was happening. Hargrove had worn his authority like a shield for so long that being escorted out of Oak Creek Memorial in handcuffs looked like a costume malfunction, like someone had finally seen under the uniform and found nothing but debt and desperation. The State Medical Board's interim suspension came through at 08 for 7 hours. Not temporary. Not pending hearing. Immediate. The investigation had revealed more than just the attempted forgery. Auditors found falsified patient notes, fraudulent billing codes, prescriptions written for non-existent procedures, a 12-year trail of cuts covered with lies, and his position used as the knife. His medical license would be revoked before lunch. By 1100 hours, his attorney would stop returning calls. By 1300 hours, his wife would retain her own counsel. By 1500 hours, the 3 nurses he'd systematically destroyed over the past decade would have lawyers too, and Oak Creek Memorial's insurance company would begin calculating settlement amounts that would make accountants weep. But right now, in room 314, Laura stood beside the bed of a man she'd saved twice, once in Baghdad, once 48 hours ago, with muscle memory and a needle. Captain Morrison squeezed her hand. Captain Chen stood at attention like a witness to something sacred. And Emma would see the news that evening when the local stations picked up the story, would watch her mother's Navy photo broadcast next to Hargrove's mugshot, would finally understand why her mom had come home crying at dawn. 2 years later, Dr. Richard Hargrove would be teaching CPR to nursing students at a Norfolk community college. $16 an hour. Plastic dummy. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. His hands that once commanded operating rooms and destroyed careers, would demonstrate the rhythm of keeping someone alive for students who didn't know his name, didn't know he'd once had a corner office at Oak Creek Memorial, didn't know he'd tried to erase someone and failed because that someone had carried her strength like a medal stitched into her jacket lining. Laura Bennett stood in Captain Morrison's hospital room, her daughter beside her clutching the faded unit patch with blood type still visible in the stitching after 20 years of being carried in a jacket pocket like a talisman, like proof, like the smallest possible shrine to someone she'd sworn she'd never forget. The wars don't always end with explosions. Sometimes they end in a hospital room with truth spoken aloud in front of witnesses who finally can no longer look away. The quiet nurse had always been telling the truth. They just hadn't been listening until the Pentagon showed up to make them hear it. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button. And answer me this: would you have signed the NDA and taken the money, or fought back? Comments are open.